All right, everybody, we are live, Dynasty Mir, Search for Huru. And today we have the brother, the awesome Professor Davis is with us today. The great Professor Davis is with us today. And today we're going to be discussing Black America versus China, who's done more for Africa. And Professor Davis, over this last, I would say, what you've been coming on for now, the last month and a half, I would say.
Right, that's correct. Yes.
Over the last month and a half, you've been in detail discussing and sharing the contributions that Black Americans have made to Africa that a lot of people don't know about. A lot in which it's not shared in I would say maybe in academic circles like yourself, but as far as people like myself or people who are watching these videos or just in your normal we'll say history courses, is not shared at all. So today we're going to discuss who's contributed more to Africa, who's built Africa up more, Black America or China. Because of course you have the stereotype, or the misinformation when it comes to Liberia, that when Black Americans attempted to contribute to Africa, you got in Liberia. But now a lot of Africans are ranting and raving in regards to what China has done for them as far as roads, infrastructure, light rails, trains, etc. But let's go ahead and unpackage this. Black America versus China, done more for Africa. Go ahead.
Great. Well, first of all, thanks for having me on your show again today, Dinus. And I'm going to come at this particular topic probably differently. There's a lot of information, and so I'm just going to, I guess, touch the tip of the iceberg and basically discuss this maybe country by country, and I think that's maybe the best way to do it. And your viewing audience and your listening audience must understand that that African Americans are historically the product of a marginal population that has been in the United States for over 500 years. But having said that, the leadership of especially the elite African Americans have never forgotten the fact that they are indeed African primarily in origin. And so what I'm going to do is to try to provide kind of a historical timeline in terms of how African Americans have engaged the African continent. And it can be argued that if you look over our long history of interacting with Africa, we've actually probably done a lot more than China. China is quite contemporary. For example, I'm going to start with Sierra Leone, and if your listening audience or your viewing audience don't know, the foundation of what became the nation of Sierra Leone was its background goes back to, if you will, Black Americans or Black Canadians who were formerly Black Americans, and these were folks who had fought on the side of the British. Lord Dunmore, who was the British governor of Virginia in the 1760s and 1770s, put out a proclamation, and he said that, listen, any Black person who would fight on the side of the British during the American Revolution will get their freedom. And so tens of thousands of enslaved African Americans basically says, you know what, I'll do it. And when the British lost the war, those Black Americans evacuated. Many went to Canada. Roughly 5,000 or so went to the UK. This was in the 1780s. So, unfortunately, once they got to Canada and the UK, the British reneged in terms of paying these Black soldiers their pensions. So they negotiated with the British, and the ones who ended up in the UK decided to go back home or go back to Africa. And so in 1785, 86, you had 400 African Americans leave London, and they sailed to the west coast of Africa, and they founded the first town called Grantsville Town. And the first governor of that town was an African American by the name of Richard Weaver from Philadelphia. Now, they went to Sierra Leone probably the worst time of the year, rainy season, and a lot of the settlers actually died off. Some had issues with the indigenous population, which did not want them there. And when the second, if you will, group of settlers came, which were the Nova Scotians in 1791, only about 64 of the originals were still there. But the Nova Scotians came on 15 ships from Halifax, Nova Scotia, Canada, in 1791, and they were the founders of Freetown,
Mm.
which is the capital now of Sierra Leone. And and a lot of your listening guests may not know that Sierra Leone, via the Anglican Church in 1827, constructed what would become a Forbay College of Forbay University. And this particular institution was probably the most premier um, college on the African continent in the 1800s. And interesting enough, its first principal or its first president was an African American by the name of Edward Jones. And Edward Jones was from the African American elite from Georgia, I believe. Went to school at Amherst College in New York. I'm sorry, in Massachusetts, and got a degree in 1826, and sailed back to Africa. And he became the first, if you will, black principal of Forbay College. And he was there for about 20 years or so, from 1840 to roughly 1860. And he laid the foundation for the most renowned black, if you will, or most renowned university in West Africa at that time. As a matter of fact, African students came from all over to go to this university. And I'm saying all this to say to you is that the foundation, keep in mind, of Sierra Leone was established by African Americans who decided, hey, we'll fight on the side of the British, and we'll go back to Africa to see if we can build something. And they did. And and 200 and some years later, you have a country that's called Sierra Leone, that was primarily established by um, Black Americans and African Canadians who had left the US and Canada and decided to go back to Africa and build a brand new society. And they did that, and they were quite successful at it. And that's just one small example in Sierra Leone. We all know about Liberia, and again, the interesting thing about Liberia, you had the first shipment of Black Americans to leave in 1820. 86 left on the Elizabeth. One of the major players who actually got to Sierra Leone was Elijah Johnson,
Mhm.
and he was what you call the third colonial agent. Liberia had colonial agents who were kind of like administrators in the foundation of the country. And interesting enough, with Elijah Johnson, as he was serving as the third colonial agent, the British came ashore and said to Elijah Johnson, "Hey, why don't you allow us to plant our flag on your soil? It will keep the native population, away from you settlers." And Elijah Johnson says, "Absolutely not," because he says if this happens, it's going to cause, it's going to basically cause more trouble to remove that flag in the future. And so what Elijah Johnson was able to do is to save, or to ensure that Liberia basically became its own independent nation. And as you've had a number of shows about Liberia on
Yeah.
this, a
It's
number of
important. It's important that we set the record straight on Liberia. So
it's extremely important. But interesting enough, and when you look at the long history of Liberia, what you'll find is that Liberia was a founding member of the Organization of African Unity, now the AU. Liberia was also a founding member of the League of Nations. Liberia was also a founding member of the United Nations.
mm,
It served as the elder state for the entire African continent. And again, in the 1970s, man, it was the most successful nation on the African continent. And this is what I do believe. If that civil war would have never happened in
yes.
1980,
Mhm.
and Tolbert would have not been killed,
Mm.
Liberia would probably be on par with a Singapore, Japan, South Korea today. But we don't want to live in the past. But it was moving in the right direction to become an economic powerhouse across the African continent. And those two countries that I just mentioned, Sierra Leone and Liberia, were actually both established by Black Americans. Sierra Leone first in the 1790s. And something else that's interesting too, the lingua franca across Sierra Leone is Creole, and Creole really is what was brought in by those returning African Americans to Africa. So again, you have two examples of where formerly enslaved blacks, and keep in mind, Dinas,
Mhm.
these African Americans are going back to Africa at the height of the transatlantic slave trade.
Yes.
This is huge. I mean, slavery is still going on across West Africa. Africans are being kidnapped and brought to the Caribbean, to South America, to the United States. And you have formerly enslaved African Americans going back, man, to build something brand new. And and they're saying to and they're saying to the world, we can govern ourselves. And I actually find that to be quite fascinating. That that they developed. Here it is. You have again, we established two brand new countries that didn't exist in the past. Those are two small examples. Another example would be Nigeria. Well, you and I have spoke offline about Nnamdi Azikiwe, and he was the first president of Nigeria. And President Azikiwe actually graduates from Lincoln University, which is a renowned historic HBCU, or historically black college. He actually was mentored. I'm sure you've heard of Ralph Bunche, who was
Black
the
Panther, right?
first black person.
Was he a
No,
Black
no,
Panther?
no, no. No, oh, no, 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 no. Ralph Bunche was he was an African American politician
Uh-huh.
who was the mediator for the Israel Palestine um, conflict in the 1940s.
Right, he
He
freed
also,
hostages. He freed hostages, right? Or was that
well, no, no, no. He was Ralph Bunche. He was a he was the first African American to win he was the first black man, period, to win the Nobel Peace Prize in
okay?
1950.
Right.
But he negotiated the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in the 1940s. He's renowned for that. But he also served as a mentor for Nnamdi Azikiwe. And
Hmm.
also Dr. William Leo Hasbury. He also served as a mentor to Nnamdi Azikiwe. And Dr. Hasbury was the founder of the African Studies Department at Howard University in 1922, I believe. And also Dr. Hasbury was one of the founding members of the Africa America Institute, which came into existence in 1953. And again, as I say, when Nnamdi Azikiwe came to the United States, he attended Howard. He also attended Storer College, which was in West Virginia. But he graduates from Lincoln in 1930, goes back to Nigeria, of course, and later on he becomes the first, the first president in 1960, I believe, when Nigeria received its independence. And you also have in Ghana Kwame Nkrumah, of course, who also graduates from a historically black college in 1939.
Right.
And he is also mentored by Hasbury, Ralph Bunche, and a number of other prominent African Americans of the day. And interesting enough, too, Kwame Nkrumah attends the famous Achimota School in Ghana. And
Right.
keep in mind,
And that was modeled after just the Tuskegee Institute, correct?
exactly. And one of the co-founders of Achimota was a Ghanaian gentleman by the name of James Agray. And Mr. Agray actually travels to the United States in 1898,
Hmm.
and he gets a full scholarship from the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church, which is an African American led institution that goes back to the 1700s. He comes to the United States. He attends Livingston College in Salisbury, North Carolina. He gets his undergrad, he gets his master's. Once he gets his master's degree, he teaches at the university for a while. He becomes a pastor. He oversees a number of churches. He goes back for a PhD at Hood College, which is another historically black university in the United States. And later on, he becomes a co-founder of the Achimota University. Now, I'm sorry, Achimota School in Ghana. He's married to an American.
Mhm.
His wife is believed to be a cousin of Frederick Douglass. His son, Orin son, Agray, becomes, interesting enough, man, the U.S. ambassador to Senegal, back in the day. And so, again, what you see with Mr. Graeber, you can see the engagement or the impact of African Americans institutions actually engaging, let's just say, not only Africans on the continent in Ghana, in Nigeria, in Liberia that I've named, also in Sierra Leone. And I could actually move on and let me just go back and say this. With Achimota, Jerry Rollins also attends that. Um, President Edward Akadu, Edward, I'm going to pronounce this wrong, please forgive me. Edward Akafu Adu, he was one of the presidents of Ghana, and also Kwame Nkrumah attends Achimota University. And South Africa, for example. Most people don't realize that South Africa and the ANC was highly tied to the African Methodist Episcopal Church, which has been in South Africa since the 1890s. And the founder of, well, the first president of the ANC was John Dubé.
Mm.
And John Dubé travels to the United States, visits Booker T. Washington in 1897. And he's so impressed by the Tuskegee uh, Institute, man, that he goes back to South Africa and he creates the Allunge Institute, which is the first black organization, or the first organization that has been organized or created by a black person in South Africa. And interesting enough about the Allunge Institute, man, when Nelson Mandela was running for president of South Africa, he symbolically cast his vote at this particular institution.
Wow.
Again, you and I spoke about Kenya.
Yes, in the,
Most people,
in the
most,
Constitution.
absolutely. Most people don't realize, for example, that our first Supreme Court Justice, Thurgood Marshall, actually wrote the Kenya Constitution and the Bill of Rights at the request of Jomo Kenyatta, which is pretty amazing. Here it is, they knew about this particular uh, person because of his history of the United States, asked Justice Marshall to come over and write the Constitution. That's Kenya. Zimbabwe. Now, you and I spoke about Strive Masiyiwa, right?
Right.
Strive Masiyiwa is the founder of Econet Wireless, which is one of the largest mobile services across the African continent. In the 1980s, Mr. Masiyiwa was actually recruited by two black Americans, the Reverend Leon Sullivan and the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, Andrew Young, who was also the former mayor of Atlanta. They were in Zimbabwe. They saw Mr. Masiyiwa when he was a young man, and they were asking him, what do you want to do? And he was saying, well, I want to go to Makerere. I believe that's a college in Uganda, I think. And Mr. Sullivan says, well, listen, if you ever in the United States, consider Morehouse. And so, long story short here, Andrew Young was looking for some African students who could come and develop their business skills in the United States. So they remembered that they had engaged Mr. Masiyiwa early on. So eventually they had him come to the United States, where he went to school for 10 years in America, went back to Zimbabwe in the 1990s, and established Econet Wireless, man. Today, Mr. Masiyiwa is a billionaire, one of the wealthiest Africans across the continent, and he's known for his philanthropic activities across Africa, across Latin America, and other parts of the world. Another example would be, were you aware that the current prime minister of Namibia is a woman?
I didn't know that. No.
Yes, and I'm gonna butcher her name, so please forgive me. Her name is Sarah Kugan. Oh my God, Kugangali. Anyway, she graduates again from at HBCU. She graduates from Lincoln University as well in 1995 with a degree, I believe, in economics. And interesting enough about Namibia is that it used to be controlled by South Africa.
Right.
and the whites who were Germans. And when they got there, they actually brought their church, which was the Rhenish Missionary Church. But these Germans were marginalizing the indigenous black population. And so the black Namibians were really upset by the fact that they had no real power, no real influence. So they met with South African AME members or African Methodist Episcopal Church members. And so in 1946, man, the black leadership of what would become Namibia did a mass conversion from the German church to the African Methodist Episcopal Church. And one of the reasons that they did that, man, is because that the African Methodist Episcopal Church has had a long history of political activity, organization, so on and so forth, and the black Namibians were able to use this institution, man, to actually help them gain their independence. And another example that I want to give you, man, you and I have talked extensively about Ethiopian Airlines, and I provided to you, clear documentation from the State Department, the U.S. State Department, and the Embassy of Ethiopia, showing and indicating that the origin of Ethiopian Airlines is with Colonel John Charles Robinson. And Colonel John Charles Robinson is an African American. He's also known as the father of the Tuskegee Airmen. This particular gentleman was actually asked to come to Ethiopia in 1934 to help Ethiopians during the Italian-Ethiopian War. He was asked by Haile Selassie in 1934. So he goes over to Ethiopia. Haile Selassie makes him the commander over the entire Ethiopian Air Force, and and working along with the Allied powers, Colonel Robinson was able to help the Ethiopians defeat the Italians. Colonel Robinson comes back to the United States. He builds an airline, if you will, here in the United States, but he's called back to Ethiopia in the 1940s. He says, "Hey, please, Colonel Robinson, come to Ethiopia, help us develop our airline." He goes back to Ethiopia in 1944. He establishes Sultan Airlines. Sultan Airlines eventually would become East African Airlines. And in 1945, East African Airlines becomes Ethiopian Airlines. Why is Ethiopian Airlines important? Well, today in 2018, Dinus, it is the largest and the most efficient airlines on the African continent. And it really serves as a training hub for all of Africa. So let me just say this in regards to and this is just a tiny example. Over 200 years of African American engagement across the African continent. Mm-hmm. And I think now maybe people are saying, well, look at what China's doing. Well, China is within the last 30, 40 years, China has emerged into becoming a superpower. And so people see, if you will, the impact of China. But what I'm saying is, if you're comparing the long history of our engagement across Africa, which can be measured in terms of improving the continent, in my view, and in my estimation, Dinus, there is no comparison between what the Chinese are doing now and what we've done in the past and what we are still doing with our institutions right across Africa.
Yes. Say that one more time.
I said, if you look at the long history of African American engagement across the African continent,
yes,
and compare it to what China has been doing, I will say within the last maybe 30, maybe 40 years, I mean, honestly, there's no way to kind of compare it at all.
Well, people are basing it on, China's investing billions and trillions of dollars into African infrastructure. I mean, and so a lot of people some people in the chat, and sorry, I was responding to somebody in the chat when you had asked me the question. So they're trying to leverage that in saying that China has done more because of the monetary amount that I guess can be accounted for somewhat has been invested in Africa by China. So what would be your response to that?
Well, and again, what I would say to that, man, if you're talking about in terms of contemporary times, I can give the person who asked the question, I can give them that. but I'm looking at the long history of African American engagement. And here's the problem, I think, with a lot of people is that the reason that I'm on your show is that people don't know this history.
Exactly. It's important.
I mean, they have no. When I tell people, for example, man, that Black Americans develop Ethiopian Airlines, the first thing that I get is you're lying.
Right.
That's the first. How could that be?
Sick. It's
How,
sick.
how could that be? There's no way. Here it is, these formerly enslaved people in the United States. No, there is no way that that they could do that at all.
Right.
As I explained to you before with Sierra Leone, I mean, for African Americans to return to the continent at the height of the transatlantic slave trade. I mean, Dinus. I mean, where have we heard about this in human history?
Never heard.
We haven't.
Nope.
And they still developed the country. And they were able to, as I mentioned to you before, with the Reverend Edward Jones, who was the president, or what they call the principal, of Foray Bay College, or Foray Bay University right now. He was there for roughly 20 years and laid the foundation for really the most prestigious academic institution in all of Africa, in all of West Africa. It was called the Athens of Africa. And this guy was a Black American from South Carolina who had a degree from Amherst University. And so what I'm saying is that, even though we were on the shores of America, we've never, ever forgotten the fact that our ancestral background has come from Africa, and we're still engaging, man. Now, I think what happens with China, China now in 2018 is a superpower, and they can see, if you will, in terms of infrastructure development. This is true, and I'm not in any ways minimizing the fact that China is doing that. But what I'm saying is that the long history, the very, very long history, man, of providing education, man, training, leadership development skills, investments. And like I say, for example, right now, man, think about this. Strive Messiah is a billionaire because of what? And I think I sent you the clip of where he's saying, listen, my success is because of Andrew Young and Dr. Lewis Sullivan.
Yes.
He's saying this. Also, too, I sent you the clip with the piece with Ethiopian Airlines. The folks, of course, the leadership, they're saying, look, we have this airport because of Colonel John Charles Robinson. That's just a fact. And again, this information, unfortunately, is not commonly known by a lot of Americans. I meet Africans all the time. They're absolutely shocked, have no clue about this. And again, Achimota, which is this renowned school in Ghana, as you said earlier, it's based on Booker T. Washington Tuskegee model. It's an exact replica. And I go back to this again. Dinus.
Yes, sir.
Justice Thurgood Marshall is writing the Constitution to Kenya.
Yeah.
That's huge. This is absolutely huge, man.
Mm-hmm.
And so these are just a few common examples that I'm actually giving you. This could be a year-long course in terms of the level.
What have I told you? You need to do a documentary, book, podcast, speaking engagements as much as possible, because this information is important and key because it's not out there. I mean, it's out there. Right. No one knows about it.
Right. And so this is one of the reasons why, again, I'm on your show, and I'm trying to get this information out to as many people as possible, because they need to, they honestly need to hear this. I mean, most people, I was watching a special, and a lot of people from Sierra Leone. I sent you, I think, a clip. They had no idea that Sierra Leone Freetown, rather, was founded by Black Americans, were Nova Scotians, but those Nova Scotians were Black Americans.
I think the issue is that they really don't tell the entire history of the Black Americans who founded Sierra Leone. They pretty much show that they came from Britain. That's what I understood. They came from the UK.
Well, they didn't. They didn't, because those 15 ships that left Nova Scotia, they sailed from Canada to West Africa. And if you look at you've heard of the Book of Negroes, right?
I've seen the series on.
Okay, The
WGN
Book of Negroes, the
canceled
Book
it.
of Negroes were the African Americans who fought for the British during the American Revolution. Once they got their freedom, their names were all listed in this book called the Book of Negroes, and they migrated on to the maritime provinces of Canada. Now, the maritime provinces included Nova Scotia,
Hmm.
Prince Edward Island, and also New Brunswick.
Hmm.
Once they got to that part of Canada, unfortunately, the British reneged in terms of giving them good property and land, and it was cold and so on and so forth. And they said, "Listen, you haven't been honest with us." And so again, they negotiated with the British. Thomas Peterson is a very very famous, if you will, African American woman from woman. He was from Wilmington, North Carolina, but he was actually kidnapped from what is now Nigeria,
Okay.
brought to Wilmington as a slave, got his freedom. He was a black loyalist, migrates to Canada, and he is a key negotiator, leaving Nova Scotia, going to Britain to say, "Hey, listen, my people in Canada are being mistreated."
Right.
And so the British agreed, well, listen, you know what? If you guys want to return to Africa, well, then we'll work with you. So Thomas Peters gets back to Nova Scotia, works with David George. David George is another key figure in Sierra Leone in history. He founded the oldest black church in America. But anyway, he, along with Thomas Peters, eventually they leave Nova Scotia, they migrate to Canada in 1791. They get there and they build Freetown, which becomes the capital of Sierra Leone. It becomes the commercial and economic capital of Sierra Leone. And believe it or not, man,
Somebody,
this
somebody
group of
said,
people,
and I think you talked about this, but somebody in the chat room said the Creoles are the descendants of the Nova Scotians.
they are. Okay, and here's the thing. That particular community, man, became the most politically, economically, and the most astute population in all of Sierra Leone. I mean, honestly, they were known for hundreds of years, man, to be the most educated class. They were the economic and political elites. As a matter of fact, it was the Creole population that led the fight for independence in Sierra Leone in 1961, I believe. I mean, but their work is renowned. And there's a famous family in Sierra Leone. It's called Eastman family,
Right.
and they are a medical. And basically they were medical elites, and not only medical elites, but they were politicians. They were they specialized in art, culture, everything. And you find their descendants today throughout Sierra Leone, parts of Ghana, also Nigeria, and also in the UK. But my point being is that these African Americans who went back and developed a brand new country, Sierra Leone, man,
Hmm.
uh, again, they were the power class, and that not only happened, man, in Sierra Leone, it also happened in Liberia as well. But I just think it's important, man, for people to understand this aspect of U.S. history. What I'm speaking to you about is it really is an extension of American history.
Correct.
Liberia is American history. What I'm speaking about in Sierra Leone is American history. These Africans from Ghana, from Nigeria, who are going to school at these historically black colleges in the United States, this is also an aspect of U.S. history. These are African Americans who are utilizing their institutions, man, to engage Africa in a constructive, in a positive way. I
Hmm.
mean, think about this, man. Many of the early presidents and prime ministers of Africa and the Caribbean went to HBCUs or historically black colleges in the United States. They were sponsored by black Americans to come to school, right? So you could develop the leadership of your own country, and I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, no. Well, the one of the questions in the chat room was, statements is, okay, would you consider Sierra Leone, Liberia, would you consider those neo-colonial governments that the Black Americans started once they founded
Good
those?
question. Good question. Liberia was more autonomous.
Hmm.
Sierra Leone was always governed, if you will, by it was always It was always a British protectorate. Now, here's the interesting thing about the Creole population. I'm going to answer your question. The Creole population, it first emerges those Nova Scotians,
Hmm.
but also too you had people coming from the West Indies, right, who actually merged with the African Americans. Then you had what they call recaptive Africans or liberated Africans, right? And so all of these three groups merged together to create what was called the Creole population. Interesting enough, of all those three groups, man, guess who was treated the worst?
Who?
And I'll name the groups again: the African Americans, the
Hmm.
West Indians, and the recaptive Africans. Well, the African Americans were actually viewed the worst because they came from the United States and they had this idea in their mind of freedom and liberty. You follow what I'm saying?
Right.
The folks who came from the West Indies, they were already British subjects. And the recaptive Africans, I mean, these people were en route to become slaves in the New World, but the ships were, of course, stopped, and so they were just resettled in Sierra Leone. But the British governing officials had more problems with African Americans because they had this concept or idea in their minds of freedom and independence because they were from the United States. And so this idea of the Declaration of Independence and these types of things permeated in their minds. And so the British says, oh my God, these people are problematic. These are the ones who are going to be the problems,
Right.
not the folks from the Caribbean who are already British subjects, or the liberated Africans who were being resettled and basically brought back into a new society. But to answer that person's questions, yes, Sierra Leone was still kind of a British protectorate. Liberia was much more independent.
Okay. Makes sense. Well, yeah, well, absolutely, because obviously, like Sierra Leone, they didn't get their independence to. In fact, I want to say Independence Sierra Leone Independence Day is in the next couple of weeks.
That is
Celebrate
correct.
next
And
couple of weeks.
interesting enough, too, right. And interesting enough, man, with that, um, I think I'm sorry. I've actually just lost my train of thought, man. But
It happened. It
but you're
happened.
but you're definitely correct.
Uh-huh.
You're definitely correct.
Right. So people who are still stuck on China because of the infrastructure that they've invested in Africa. I mean, they built the damn African Union, even though they bugged it allegedly. No, they bugged it. Um, Again, what would be your argument or rebuttal to say, hey,
Well, you know what? And what I would say is that Liberia was a founding member of the African Union. See,
right,
I- I'm actually talking about not only education. I'm not. I'm also talking about political institutions. These types of things. China is the new kid on the block.
mhm,
It's what they're talking about, man. They're talking about China is bringing, if you will, material wealth to contemporary Africa. And let me just say this to you, man. I think it's a good idea for Africans, man, to sit down at the negotiating table and discuss how they want to move forward. I'm just hoping that Africa is getting something out of the deal that's going to be beneficial to the masses of their people, and they're not going to be marginalized by another superpower. Look, we must keep in mind here's the problem as I see it with Africa: 1,500 years of the Arab slave trade,
mm,
400 and some years of the transatlantic slave trade. After that was over, roughly 100 years of being completely colonized, with the exception of Liberia and Ethiopia.
mhm,
Then after that, you had the impact of the Cold War. Then after the impact of the Cold War, you had neo-colonialism. And
right.
so, yes, China is the new economic powerhouse on the block, but are those Chinese doing what's in the interest you know of of the entire African continent,
Of course, they're serving their
or
own
is
needs.
this happening? Are there a few Africans who are going to benefit from what China is doing? Are those leaders across Africa, are they looking out for their people? That's the issue. And let me just say this, man: the African Americans who engaged Africa, they weren't there necessarily to dominate Africa. They were there, man, to kind of engage Africa, to help Africans actually build their own. new institutions themselves. You follow what I'm saying? They
Right.
were utilizing their home-based institutions in the United States to engage Africa on that level.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, again, people are still okay. The question in the chat room was, what are Black Americans doing now as far as contributing to Africa that's on the level of what China is doing?
You're asking apples and oranges.
Okay.
And I think, and I think, and I may be, and I may be reading the question, and I may be reading into this the wrong way. If the question is, if you're talking about building infrastructure across the African continent in terms of that, China has 1.4 billion people,
Right.
they can go all over the world to do that. Listen, it's just not happening on that level. I'm just saying that African Americans are utilizing their historic institutions to re-engage and to
Right.
work with the African continent, and they've done that for the last 200 and something years, and they've done it in such a way, man, not to marginalize African people. And when I see what's happening in China, well, I'm not convinced
Right.
that Africa is there just to help the continent. I'm just not convinced at all. And if if someone can convince me that the Chinese are there for goodwill, I would love to see proof.
Hmm. Somebody posted the name of an article. Posted an article out of Forbes. How China's $60 billion for Africa will drive global prosperity. Now, is Africa going to benefit from this, do you think, or is this all going to the pockets of China?
You know what? I honestly don't know, and I do know that their approach. There's a book that was written by Howard French. And we spoke a number of years ago. The name of the book is called China's Second Continent.
Okay.
And Howard French, he's an African American who's a China expert, and he's somewhat reluctant in terms of in terms of what the real purpose of China's role in Africa. Let me just say this to you, Dinah. I, I wish this conversation
Mm-hmm.
was truly about what Africans are doing for themselves. Look, and what I mean by that is this. We know the legacy of European colonialism. We know the legacy of Arab colonialism, right,
Right.
across Africa, which neither have been good. And I would think to myself, what? Wait a minute here. If I was an African on the continent, right, I would be somewhat skeptical about what the government of China is doing.
Right.
And to me, it seems to me that I don't hear enough Africans having more skepticism about the future of their continent. To,
Mm-hmm.
to me, that's quite problematic.
Right. I wonder how Africans in the chat room feel about that, as far as what are Africans actually doing for China? Because I know when it comes to whenever that topic is brought up, is always there's too much corruption. The leaders are incompetent. That's why we need China. That's usually what I hear. What are your thoughts on that?
I'm thinking, because I'm disturbed by those types of comments. Because what it says to me, Don, is that there are 54 independent countries in Africa, 54 independent countries, and and I'd like to believe that the leadership of some of these nations can actually take control of their own destiny, and they're not expecting some outside force man to kind of save them in such a way. Or if they're going to engage with China, I need to see some type of evidence where it's a win-win situation.
Hmm.
And from my vantage point, I just don't see that
Well,
at
everybody's just
all.
saying infrastructure. They're building infrastructure. They're building infrastructure. That's pretty much then what everybody's saying in the chat room, and all I hear is they're building infrastructure.
Okay, I'm going to ask this question. I'm going to throw this, man. Okay,
Go ahead.
why couldn't the Africans build their own infrastructure?
Corruption, money mismanagement. leadership's incompetent.
And guess what that sounds like to me?
Go
I
ahead.
could be wrong.
No.
What
Go
that
ahead.
sounds like, what that sounds like to me is that Africans are inferior. They're
Mm-hmm.
not incapable. They're not incapable of basically managing their own affairs.
Mm-hmm.
In order for them to get something done, they have to go to the Europeans, they have to go to the Arabs, they have to go to the Chinese, but they can't go to Africans.
Right. No,
I
you're
I
absolutely you're right. I mean,
I actually have problems with that. And
mhm.
what that says to me is, I don't know if it's low self-esteem. I'm just disturbed by this particular type of attitude or worldview because it says to me, bring in somebody else who can do it because Africans can't do it. I'm honestly disturbed by this particular type of mindset.
Let me ask you this, Professor Davis. After well, China wasn't really colonialized, just Hong Kong, right? I never really
Oh
studied
no, 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 no. They were definitely marginalized. Oh, absolutely.
well,
Yes, yes, yes.
colonialized Chinese.
Well, the British, the Japanese. Yes, during the 1930s, man, Chairman Mao basically did what it was called the Great Leap Forward.
Cultural
Thank
revolution.
you.
Right.
The Cultural Revolution closed off China to the world. So, and unfortunately, that was a horrific period. Millions of people, I believe, were just
But
killed.
let me ask you this: do you think it was needed? Would China be where it is today if Mao did not go that route?
They looked inward. They absolutely looked inward as a culture,
Mm-hmm.
and basically they got their act together. And let me just say this about China with its 1.3, 1.4 billion people. I think that I'm going to kind of draw a parallel or draw a comparison. And maybe this may not be fair, but just for the sake of the conversation, that China, there's a lot more homogeneity in
Right.
China than there is in Africa. For example, of the 1.3 or 1.4 billion Chinese, some 90+% of that population are Han Chinese, right? And so they're ethnically the same. Roughly 9% is something else, right? And in Africa, my God, every 50 miles there's cultural diversity, and so I just think that's a issue when it comes to Africa. There's just so much diversity whereby it's actually hard to unify in that regard. And so I think once China closed itself off to the world, it was easier for them to kind of, if you will, deal with their problems
Hmm.
and to and actually to move the country forward. Now, I do think that it's important that the Chinese are building infrastructure. But what's truly disturbing to me,
Uh-huh.
Africans should be building their own infrastructure. In my mind's eye,
Hmm.
this should be happening by Africans on the continent. It shouldn't be happening, or even Africans in the diaspora, right? And but for them to kind of rely on these outside forces, unless it's going to benefit the masses, is extremely problematic. And I think that the world is going to constantly see Africans as not able not able to handle their own affairs, as I said before.
These white supremacists have this whole the African sub-Saharan Africans IQ is the lowest. So, they use stuff like this, like what we're talking about, speaking on as far as Africans not building their own infrastructure as leverage to back that. So, who cares? But that's
Right. And so, and all that I'm saying, man, is that Africans are as capable as any other group of people. Human beings are human beings.
all right.
And all that I'm saying, man, listen, the engagement, whether it's Europe or China or whoever, that's fine. But I'm wondering, how is it benefiting the general population, the man or woman on the street? And that's just my concern, man. And no one's denying that they're developing infrastructure. Look, Europeans carved up those countries, right? But
Mhm.
they carved up those countries, man, for their benefit. So
Right.
I'm wondering sometimes, The Chinese who are building across the African continent, are they doing this for their own benefit?
Of course, of course, it's
And,
for their own benefit. It's not a
and,
not a nonprofit. This is an ACON like in Africa.
and so my point with that, so if that's the case, then okay, then are Africans making any real progress? If they are allowing, let's just say, well,
No,
they were
no,
colonized.
no. I mean, if China's building up the infrastructure and Africans, a lot of Africans are ranting and raving about it. Thank you, Chinese. Thank you, China. We needed you. Thank you. Then no.
And see, that's my issue. And so, again, one of the reasons why I wanted to come on the show is to discuss, this is the long, as I said before, the history of how we have engaged Africa, man, in constructive ways. And these ways are measurable. And like I said before, man, I'm going to go back to Ethiopian Airlines, right? It is the best airline on the African continent. It serves as a training hub for all of Africa for the most part. It's on par, man, with any American or German, Swedish, or Canadian airline. And so to me, and to know that African Americans played a role in establishing that, man, is huge. You did get a chance to take a look at that brief video from the State Department that I sent you, right?
Yes.
The one that actually showed the U.S. ambassador, the former U.S. ambassador of Ethiopia, actually highlighting Colonel John Charles Robinson and the statue of him in the capital of Ethiopia, Addis Ababa, paying homage to the fact that he founded this airline, which is the largest on the African continent.
Yes.
And so that's huge. And and I'll say this, Dinus, to me, and this may not be of any significance to you, but the fact that again that a formerly enslaved population for a couple of centuries in the United States could actually go back to Africa to actually build something like this is absolutely incredible.
Right. Oh, it's very important.
It's extremely, and the fact that we, like I said, established a couple of countries. I mean, it really is beyond belief. I mean, it's going full circle, a 180 almost. Is what I'm trying to say. So, but you know what? I would even, if I was a betting man, Dinus, I would probably say that the information that I'm sharing with your viewing and your listening audience, probably most people are not even aware of this information.
No, they're not. That's why it's always
And
refreshing when you come on.
sure, sure. And and those were just a few simple examples, man, about what I wanted to say in that regard, man, in terms of this long history of engagement. Now, when you were in Namibia, were you aware that the African Methodist Episcopal Church had played a role in terms of helping to organize uh, people who were in SWAPO?
Let's do this. Let's go ahead and speak on. I know you speak on the AME a lot in the role in Africa. Yeah, I guess we can go ahead and speak on that. But no, I was not. No.
Right. Well, the AME has again, they've been in Africa, man, since the 1850s, first in Liberia, Sierra Leone, but they're in roughly 25, 26 countries across the African continent, man. And what they've been able to do is to build universities in West Africa, in Southern Africa. They've also built hundreds of clinics and hospitals across the continent as well.
Hmm.
But they were asked to come to South Africa by the South Africans, man, to help them with the anti-apartheid movement. And so the church came and actually brought leadership skills and built the university. Wilberforce University is in Edmonton, South Africa, which is not too far from Johannesburg. And so the AME Church primary mission across Africa, man, has not just been religious, man.
Oh,
It's really been institute.
No,
Go
go
ahead.
ahead and finish, and then I want to share something with you. But go ahead. Go ahead and finish. I'm
No,
sorry.
no, that's quite all right. It was institution building.
Mhm.
Africans said, well, listen, you've been around for centuries. And the AME Church, keep in mind too, man, that it's a global institution. I mean, it's all over the world. US, Canada, South America, Europe, Asia, all over, and and basically it the Africans on the continent who joined, it enabled them to travel all over the globe, man, to actually plead their cause for liberation. And this is what this institution has actually been able to do for folks on the continent. Oh, please continue.
I'm gonna say, I just lost my train of thought. Ah, I just lost my train of thought, Professor Davis.
That's quite all right.
Oh man, I just lost my train of thought. Somebody said something in the chat room, and it triggered something, and I just go ahead. But I might cut you off when it comes to me. But go ahead.
No, that's quite all right. But no, but the African Methodist Episcopal Church, man, is an amazing institution, man. And like I say, they've been around for a long time.
Here we go. Here we go. Now, so I was speaking with a lady in South Africa today. She was saying that the reason why white state empowered in South Africa post-apartheid is because the South Africans did not have the skills to keep what the African what the apartheid regime had in place. They didn't have the skills to keep it going. But she was saying that they're just using them, and in a matter of time that they're going to be removed and they're going to take over. Kind of like when you have a new employer somewhat, or a new co-child, or if you have an acquisition of a company, how that new company will keep the employees in place for 6 months or a year to let them go. That's what she was saying in regards to South Africa. Now, could this be the case in regards to the role that China is playing in Africa? That, hey, we'll let them build all the infrastructure, but there's going to come a point in time where we're going to tell China to get the hell out.
Well, let me ask this question. Did that happen with the Europeans who carved up those countries? They got
the African countries got their independence, I guess. I don't. So
well, look, those, and honestly, I'm not trying to be negative at all, but those borders of those countries, man, really have been set to really support the needs of Europe, and that's the truth. And and yes, they did get their independence, man. So what really does that mean? I mean, and I want to take into consideration that yes, most of these countries are young. So I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt, man, of being young democracies, trying to kind of find their way in a very, very complex world. And and the point that you make about Africans allowing the Chinese to build infrastructure, and after they do that, you got to go. That may be the case. I don't know. I honestly don't know. But my hope is that the governing officials of these various countries, I am hoping that when they actually negotiate with China, that they're that they're doing so in the interest of the vast majority of their people, because Africa right now suffers from weak institutions. In my judgment, they suffer from a lot of weak institutions, and so I honestly hoping that again that these are smart and shrewd politicians who are looking out for the interests of their own people in the long run.
Somebody in the chat room said that somebody like me and yourself should be worried about our communities here in America that are being gentrified versus worrying about what China's doing in Africa.
You know what? Let me just, and whoever said that, man, listen, I'm an African American. I have as much right to be concerned about Africa as any African who was born on the continent.
Wow.
And to take this even further, and the Africans who come to the United States, let me just say this, man, they have benefited from the legacy of the African American narrative. African Americans have used the institutions that they've developed over the last several centuries to engage the African continent. So again, we have a right to be concerned about all of Africa. And Dias, guess why?
Why?
The average Black American is an amalgam of Africans from as far north as Mauritania to as far east as Madagascar. When I did my genetic testing, Dias, here's what my results said. My ancestors were from Mauritania,
Hmm.
Mali, Nigeria. They were also from Madagascar. I had some, of course, the European part and all of that, and Native American. So guess what? So for your guest who feels that I should be just concerned about Black Americans, absolutely not. Yes, I'm African American, but guess what? My ancestral background also comes from Africa.
Right,
So,
and we have a couple of the, we're not African, we're native indigenous Moors.
well,
Yeah, they're in there trolling too. So
we are of African ancestries. Our ancestors primarily come from all over Africa. You know, most Black Americans have some European ancestry as well too. So we have most of us have English, Scottish, etc., and all that, and some of us have Native American ancestry. But to get back to your question, I can be concerned about Africa, sure, and African Americans should be. Yes, my point of origin is the United States because we've been there for 500 years, but but also too, I can be concerned about it. And guess what, man? If African Americans really thought that way, man, think about this, man. Think about all the hundreds of thousands of Africans who've been educated at our institutions.
right.
I think if that would have never happened, man, the continent would have been worse off.
Mm. Wow. Why do you say that? Why do you think the continent would have been worse off?
Well, I'm glad that you look because think about this, man. We have allowed, as I said before, Nnamdi Azikiwe graduates from an HBCU. Kwame Nkrumah graduates from an HBCU. These Africans had a chance to come to the United States, man, and to sit with some of the best, bright African American minds in the world. You follow what I'm saying?
Hmm.
That could help shape them, so they can go back home, man, and develop their own countries.
Right.
And so that actually says something about Black Americans, a formerly enslaved population that would do that. Now, I said this to you before, man. Unfortunately, uh, most Africans on the continent have done very little to engage the Black diaspora.
Right.
And I have African friends from all over the place, North Africa, East, so on and so forth. And I often ask them, how have you engaged the Black diaspora? How have you leveraged your institutions to somehow improve the quality of life for African Americans or Blacks in Canada or Blacks in the Caribbean, etc.? And whenever I ask that question, I get the blank stare, like, hmm. And so, Dinus, let me just say this to you too, and I mentioned this to you earlier. And here's the tragedy, I think, of the Black race in some ways. Uh, Chinese, for example, I've traveled to 6 continents,
Mhm.
right? And I've happened to visit Chinatowns all over the world:
Mhm.
Australia, Singapore, Vancouver, Canada, San Francisco, so on and so forth. Wherever you go, anywhere in the world, Chinese are Chinese. There's a continuity. They all speak the same language. You follow what I'm saying? They have a cultural continuity. Also, too, when you look at the Anglo world, and what I mean by the Anglo world, the US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, the UK, they have a cultural continuity, right?
Right.
I've traveled to all those places. There's a cultural continuity. When it comes to Black folks, because of the transatlantic slave trade, the East Africa slave trade, which was 1,500 years, the transatlantic 400 years, there's this break in cultural continuity. And so the Africans unfortunately see the Blacks in the diaspora as something else. Right?
Correct.
And honestly, that is problematic. And they're blaming the folks who were the product of enslavement as if like, well, it's your fault. And that's just not the case at all. Because again, I think that something happened on the continent whereby for many centuries people were actually uprooted from
Mm.
Africa and scattered across the globe, man. And once they got to the Americas, they had to create a brand new identity. And and there was no expectation of Africans coming to kind of assist their descendants in the West. It just wasn't going to happen. And so, that's somewhat problematic. And so, in that regard, I think that I am, I look at other groups of people, like, and I use China as an example, and the Anglo world as an example, because those groups of people have a continuity of history. And unfortunately, we blacks in the West, Black Americans, Black Canadians, West Indians, blacks in South America, there was a breakage. And unfortunately, oftentimes when we try to engage Africans in a constructive way, then, I think that maybe, they don't know how to, to kind of react, because again, the blacks in the West, there really are new people.
Right.
And what I mean by that, man, we had to kind of create something brand new and separate.
Can you speak on a little bit on Booker T. Washington and his role in, I guess, keeping Liberia from being colonialized and also African exclusion?
Yes, absolutely. This was during 1905 through 1912 was the Liberian Crisis. And this was during the time where the British, the French, and the Germans were actually sailing along the west coast of Africa. And that they were asking the United States, well, what's your stance, or what's your, is Liberia a colony? And the U.S. was extremely slow to respond to that, because what these three colonial powers wanted to do is that they wanted to colonize Africa. And so the U.S. ambassador to Liberia had reached out to Booker T. Washington during this time. And he said to President Washington, and Booker T. Washington was the president of Tuskegee Institute, now Tuskegee University. He said, President Washington, Liberia is in trouble. And he explained to him that the Europeans were trying to colonize it. So Booker T. Washington basically had a commission of Liberian delegates. He had them come to the United States. And from 1905 until 1912, Booker T. Washington served as the negotiator, the chief negotiator between Liberia and the United States. And he was able to, to actually get a loan from the United States to ensure that Liberia maintained its freedom. If Washington had not done that, man, there's a high probability that Liberia could have been actually colonized. And so what he would, and Booker T. Washington was a shrewd negotiator, man. Along with the Liberians, they were playing these colonial powers against one another, and it worked. But a long story short, man, after the negotiation was over, Liberia's sovereignty was actually saved, and it maintained its independence. The rest of Africa at that time, man, were completely colonized. The rest of Africa, and think about this, man. Think about this. You had an entire continent, 12 million square miles, right? And the only two pieces of independent land at this time was Ethiopia and Liberia. And keep in mind, man, one of the reasons why Ethiopia maintained its independence, as I had mentioned to you earlier, man, Colonel John Charles Robinson, a Black American who was asked to come to Ethiopia during the Second Italian-Ethiopian War, where he served as the commander over their Air Force. At the request of Haile Selassie, come and serve, and he did. Mm-hmm. And he helped Haile Selassie defeat the Italians. And as I stated to you before, he comes back and builds the airline. He builds Ethiopian Airlines in 1945.
Yes. Cool. So somebody in the chat room said, okay, so us discussing this, what's the end game? And then we'll go ahead and close out.
What do you mean? Purpose.
Go ahead. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Well, no. Well, no, the purpose really was, man, is to share the long history of engagement of the Black diaspora, more specifically African Americans, with role that African Americans have played in terms of engaging Africa. As I stated to you before, man, and you and I have spoken offline, that there are many, many, many Black institutions that are working across the African continent as we speak today, that are transforming the continent in a lot of ways. Did you know, Dinus, that in the 1990s, as late as the 1990s, most African countries did not have access to a telephone?
No, I didn't know. Well, no, I didn't know that.
I mean, most of them did not. They did not. Most
Okay.
of them did not. The vast majority of the population did not have access. Now, can you imagine that? And as I had stated to you before, Strive Masiyiwa was able to develop Equinet wireless, man, which is it's all over Africa. Well, it's the primary carrier in Zimbabwe, but it's all over the world now. And so again, he was able to do that by engaging with the Black diaspora. And so the end game is ongoing engagement
Right.
across Africa. And I think that again, man, I don't think sometimes, man, that uh, enough um, enough continental Africans understand that this engagement has been going on for a long time, and that the outcome of this engagement is measurable. And I think again, man, that it is that as long as they don't see how we all connect, it's going to be a problem moving forward. I tell Africans all the time, the ones who come to the United States, that they're benefiting from a long legacy of blacks being in the United States, who have paid a heavy price for them enjoying the amenities of America or the Western world. That was the price that was paid for that, and that's just the reality of it. You can't get around it. I read a long article, and I think I sent this to you a while back, man, where it was written by an Indian American. The guy was from India, and he basically wrote this long article saying that, listen, we have got to pay homage to Black Americans because they paved the way for us Indian immigrants in the United States to be successful. Without their narrative and suffering and all of that, that we would never, ever be where we are in the United States today. And this guy was Indian, from India. And he just said, that's just the reality of it. That's just the reality of it, man. But again, getting back to what I'm saying is the way that I laid out my points earlier is that I wanted to show just a few countries in Africa where we had engaged the continent, and I think that they're better off. And the beautiful thing about this, Dinus, is that this stuff is actually written
Right.
and documented, and it's not as if it's being made up. But unfortunately, people just don't know it. I think it's not taught in Africa at all. Like, for example, when I went to Ghana, I was shocked that they really don't teach about the transatlantic experience at all.
Just
And
surface
I just think,
that.
right, right. And I honestly think that's a part of it. There's a lack of, there's, for whatever reason, people are just not willing to kind of seriously look at this information. And I don't know if it's a lack of confidence on the part of from Africans on the continent. I just don't know. I don't know. Maybe, and I'm going to throw this out here, man.
No, no, no,
Maybe
no.
the 1500.
I tell you why. As far as slavery, why it's only taught on the surface levels, because we'll be implicating a lot of tribes, and a lot of people don't want to face that.
Well, but also too, maybe, and I'm going to say maybe because, the 1500 years of the Arab slave trade and the 400 and some years of the European, I don't know, maybe it's just buried deep in the psyche of people, and they just don't want to remember or be reminded of that. But it happened. I mean, my God, man, there are hundreds of millions of people in the Western world.
Mm-hmm.
That's and these people are the result of that transaction. And so and think about this, man. No other population on the globe has experienced that type of historic event. Whites did not. Yes, there were white slaves, but not to the extent where you have tens of millions of people that are scattered across the globe in that way. It didn't happen with the Chinese or South Asians, but it did happen to African people. I mean, there's a reason why there are 100 million Africans in Brazil, or there are 50 plus million in the United States, or there are roughly 35 to 40 million in the Caribbean, etc. And I just think that I'll just say this, man. Until we have a day of reckoning, and come to the realization that, look, there's some things that we've done which have caused our own demise, man. That we're not collectively, as a group of people, as a race of people, are going to move forward. We can't sweep this stuff under the rugs. There's just it's not gonna it's not gonna work. And I just think that we need to accept what happened, move on, and don't act as if it didn't happen. It did, and let's just try to grow from it. But in closing, man, like I say, man, those few examples of African American engagements that I shared with you, I think are definitely evidence that if you look at the longevity, you can see where I think, and I would argue that that our role in Africa has been much more important historically than the Chinese, who are actually newcomers on the block, and we didn't we weren't trying to kind of marginalize Africans to their detriment.
Yes.
The Chinese, I don't know. I would be really, really concerned about that, man. And if I was an African on the continent, man, I would really be talking to my leadership and asking the question: is this good for the vast majority of African people, or are only a few people going to benefit from what the Chinese are doing?
Right.
The proof of the pudding to me would be this, man. 20 years down the road, maybe we will no longer see people who are trying to cross the Mediterranean Sea, right?
I hope.
Going into, trying to get to Europe. Hopefully we'll see people who are staying on the continent, building businesses, developing the infrastructure of their economies, building schools, establishing brand new businesses, creating the Wakanda that Africa should be.
Correct.
That's what I like to see.
Me as well. Well, Professor Davis, thank you so much for coming on again. Please share with everybody your contact information and also the projects you're working on, if you would like to. Sure.
Yeah, I am finishing up a couple of books. And again, as I mentioned to you before, one is the book which is pretty much done here. It's tracing the history of the African American experience. That's one. The other book is I also look at the Pacific Island slave trade during the 1860s through 1904, when South Sea Islanders were being kidnapped and brought to Australia, specifically to New Zealand, right, and to New South Wales to work on the sugar plantation. Also, too, I've been speaking across the nation in regards to not only African American history, but also Black history, because I think it's extremely important that we know the contributions that we have made to the planet. But you can reach me at my email at Davis, Davis, L as in Larry, N as in Nathaniel, 20750 at yahoo.com.
All right, perfect. Professor Davis, thank you so much for coming on. It was great as always. Hopefully we could get you We could part two. Hopefully we get, oh, not, well, somebody was saying part two. I'm reading a comment at the same time. Part two about Africans versus China and their contributions to African Americans. Somebody said we should do a video on that. So so China's contribution to African Americans, all the weave stores and liquor stores and, you know, all the stores at the flea market. So I guess we'll build on that. And as far as Africans, I don't know.
Well, you could actually have that same conversation about that, man. On the African continent. I mean, that could be that's almost the same. But anyway, I understand.
Mm-hmm. But Professor, we got to get you back on soon though, because we got some more stuff to talk about.
Well, great, man.
I know you're busy. You got to schedule me in. You have to.
Well, no, well, sure. Well, listen, I've enjoyed the conversation, man. And honestly, I hope folks got something out of that, and maybe a better understanding, of the level of engagement, man, because it is real and it's measurable, man, and it's history that people should be aware of. And I'll just say this, man. I would love to see one day where some nation in Africa, just one, once they develop a stronger infrastructure to say, you know what, hey, let's try to re-engage our descendants in the Western world, in a constructive way. Let's basically give them the opportunity to kind of come back to, let's just say, I don't know, I'm going to throw a country out there, I don't know, Botswana. So I can reintroduce them to what Africa is. And I would love to see that happen, man, where continental Africans are actually taking the first step to truly engage the Black diaspora.
Well, in Black Panther, they built a rec center, or they redid the project.
Listen, I hope that's a joke, I'm sure, right?
Yeah, but I mean, yes, we got the PJs. But actually, I'm gonna tell you a real story. So in Chicago, let me hold on one second. I'm pretty sure you've heard of this. In Chicago, hold on one second. Let me pull this up real quick. All right, so in Chicago, there is a bank,
from Ghana,
Chicago. Right. Ghana, a group from Ghana acquired that bank. I don't know, it was a Black bank that was about to go under.
I think that's fantastic, man. And like I say, that's a good thing. That's really, 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 because as you know, we have a long history of engagement across Ghana. And I think that's fantastic, again, because they are the mother continent. And so
right.
I think that Africa should be taking the lead in that regard. I truly believe that, man. That's the way it should happen. But I'll just say this: I don't give up hope. So I understand.
I'm not giving up hope.
Right, and so I know that the countries are very new, very young, and so they have to kind of develop infrastructure. But once it is developed, man, I'm hoping that they decide, you know what, maybe let's reach back and try to reconnect and do some constructive things, because Lord knows African Americans have done it for a very, very long time. And as I said before, being formerly enslaved people, just our level of engagement, man, to me, it's been massive. And I just think that unfortunately, this information is known at the academic level, but I just don't think the average everyday person has been privy to this type of information. And so thanks for giving me the opportunity to share with your audience, sir.
And Lucky Roxy in the chat room says, I love Professor Davis. He keep it real instead of sugarcoating things. See, they love you.
Well, some of them.
Yeah. Well, I mean, everybody's not gonna love you. Everybody doesn't love me, but
Well, right. Well, and again, I just think it's important, man, to just kind of, just to tell the truth about this information. And so, and I think that some people will like it, as you say, other people will not, and that's just the way the ball bounces. Anyway, Dynas, thank you so much, man, and we'll talk soon.
Yes, sir. I'll talk to you. In fact, we'll talk after this. Let me. I just have to go pick up my son. I'll give you a call on the way.
Thank you.
No problem. All right, everybody.
All
Thank
right.
you again for joining us. Please go to search for Uhuru on Instagram, Snapchat, Twitter, and Facebook. Please like the video. Please share the video. Also go to searchforuhuru.com, go to africapersonified.africa, go to dynasamir.com, and go to amazon.com and search your name, Dynasamir. Till next time, Lucky Roxy and everybody who super chatted, thank you so much. And Lucky Roxy, make sure you email me your physical address so I can send you a postcard. Let me email me your physical address. Let me put my email in here real quick for you. All right, everybody, peace.